My men are being unmercifully shelled. They cannot hold out if another attack is launched. The fine line and my headquarters are being plastered with heavy guns and the town is being swept by shrapnel. I myself am okay, but the front line is being buried. Gordon Bennett. In August 1914, Australia was a dominion within the British Empire, a status it shared with the other white self-governing colonies such as Canada, New Zealand, South Africa and Newfoundland. Although the constitution drafted when the Australian Federation was formed in 1901, it bestowed on the national government the power over external affairs. This was not interpreted to mean the right to manage diplomacy and international relations. Rather, in the decade after the Federation, Australian politicians and the public accepted that the imperial government in London would conduct foreign policies on their behalf. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914, there was no questioning that this would commit Australia to the war effort, and Australia would go along willingly to war. The small federal cabinet, many of whom had been born in Britain, rushed to offer Britain material support, despite the fact that the British government had not consulted with the Dominions on this major foreign policy issue, as it had been assured to them on the 1911 Imperial Conference. On the 3rd of August, Australia agreed to offer London the immediate use of the Small Royal Australian Navy, or the RAN, and a force of 20,000 men to be maintained at Australia's expense and deployed as British military authorities choose and saw fit. The offer for the RAN to serve within the Royal Navy was not surprising. All pre-war imperial defence planning assumed that this would be the case and the RAN would be led by a British naval officer. But the offer for the RAN to serve within the Royal Navy was not surprising. All pre-war imperial defence planning assumed that this would be the case and the RAN would be led by a British naval officer. But the offer for the infantry force was far more significant. The Defence Act of 1903 had precluded the deployment of small Australian regular army forces overseas, precisely because Australians feared of being enshrined in imperial conflict. Hence, all men of the new Australian imperial force would have to be volunteers. However, in the first months of the conflict, there was almost no opposition to the commitment of the Australian imperial force. Many Australians in 1914 had been either born in the United Kingdom or of Anglo-Celtic descent. There was a profound emotional and cultural identification with Britain, the mother country, and saw no contradictions of being Australian and British subjects at one time. Their nationalism was positioned within the framework of imperial loyalty, and as the champions of unshameful racial immigration policies, white Australia, they revelled in being part of the British race. More pragmatically, however, Australia recognised that the security of their vastly sparsely populated continent was dependent upon the maintenance of the British naval dominance in Asia and the Pacific region. If Britain was defeated in Europe, Australians would then come under German dominance, or even worse, the great influence of Japan ever since its victory in the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, presenting an alarming threat to the north. Beyond this, Australians saw the German occupations of another small nation such as Belgium a just cause worth fighting for. Hence, the government's call for 20,000 volunteers was met within a few weeks of the outbreak of the war, and by the end of 1914 over 50,000 men had enlisted. In the absence of opinion surveys, we know little about why they volunteered, but it seemed they were motivated by a mix of idealism, peer pressure, a sense of adventure, and the opportunity for well-paid employment, all of which was crouched within the rhetoric of imperial loyalty and imperial duty. There were, however, some voices of dissidence, if only on the margins of politics. The press of the large trade union movement, which was influenced by syndicalism and Marxism, saw the real war being won between labour and capital. As the left saw it, the only people who would benefit from the slaughter and carnage of the war would be the businessmen, which radical cartoons depicted as the bloated polocrats raiding the family larder in the absence of the soldier. These suspicions were confirmed by the radical disruption of the Australian economy after the outbreak of the war. Within the high level of dependency on international trade, Australia was affected badly by the shortages of shipping and the British embargo on trade with enemy countries such as Germany, Turkey and other countries. The failure of the federal government to control prices would soon become a running sore in Australian political life, and the question of inequality of economic sacrifice would then parallel the debate about equality in military service. The Royal Australian Navy was rendered largely invisible within the operations of the Royal Navy. For example, they only had escort duties in the North Sea and the Mediterranean. The only naval operation which captured the Australian public's imagination was the sinking of the German cruiser SS Emden by Her Majesty's Australian ship the Sydney near the Cocos Islands on the 9th of November 1914. The Australian Flying Corps, meanwhile, they would play a role in the Palestine campaign and on the Western Front, It only consisted of 4 squadrons. The first Australian troops to fight overseas were part of a mixed service force quickly raised in September 1914 to occupy German colonies in northeast New Guinea and nearby islands. At the same time, New Zealand also occupied German Samoa, South Africa took Southwest Africa, and to much of the concern of Australia, Japan seized the islands of Micronesia, Tsingtao, and other things to the north of the equator. It was bound for Europe, but with training camps in England being crowded with Canadian troops and the Ottoman Empire entering the war, the Australians were disembarked in Egypt. In April 1915, they were included in the Anglo-French force to invade the Gallipoli Peninsula. The landings of the Australians at what would later be known as The landing of the Australians at what would later be known as Anzac Cove was, like the campaign as a whole, a strategic failure. Lauded by the euphoric press, the landings laid the seeds of a narrative of Australian exceptionalism, courage and resourcefulness in the face of impossible odds, heroism despite terrible wounds, and the extraordinary physical feats of a profoundly challenging terrain. Although the battle for the Gallipoli Peninsula was soon settled into a stalemate comparable to that of the Western Front, and the attempts to break the Ottoman lines in August would fail, the image of Australians perched in dugouts on Pentress cliffs gave the campaign a particular hold on the popular imagination. It was a minority of a total Allied loss of 46,000 deaths in this campaign, but this did little to inhibit the growing appropriation by the Australians of Gallipoli as a campaign that was essentially Australian. Even though the New Zealanders in the word Anzac tended to be marginalised in later years, despite the New Zealanders suffering nearly 2,500 deaths at Gallipoli. Gallipoli is now coded in Australia for the First World War, but when Australia went to the Western Front, the casualties at Gallipoli were rapidly eclipsed by those of the Australian Imperial Force on the Western Front. Deployed in France in the first half of 1916, the Australians were engaged in a divisionary attack from the Battle of the Somme on the 19th of July at Fromelles. Almost a classic of poor British planning by the British command, this action resulted in the highest casualty rates of 5,533 dead and wounded. However, the subsequent use of the 1st, 2nd and 4th Divisions in the Battle of the Somme, more notably in Pozières and Monique Farm in July to September 1916, caused for a high casualty. Some of 23,000 casualties were suffered in 42 days, making the windmill site at Pozières in the woods of Charles Bean a ridge more densely sown with Australian sacrifice than any other place on earth. After enduring a terrible winter at the Somme, the Australian troops were deployed at Bellecourt in April to May 1917 as part of the Battle of Arras, launched by the British in support of the disastrous French offensive by General Robert Nivelle. Notable for the botched use of the first generation of tanks and the capture of the largest single number of Australian prisoners of war, 1,170, but the keep fuel an Australian perception that they were being misused by the British High Command. The subsequent attack at Messines near Ypres in June 1917, however, was a major operational, but not a strategic success. All 5 Australian divisions, all Australian artillery units and medical support teams were joined into the protracted Third Battle of Ypres, or the Battle of Passchendaele, from the 31st of July to mid-November 1917. The actions at Menin Road from the 20th of September 1917 and Polygon Woods from the 26th of September 1917 and Bunstead from the 4th of October 1917 all gained most of their objectives and might have been remembered as victories, had not for British Commander-in-Chief General Douglas Haig insisting on continuing the attacks in the wasteland of Passchendaele in October and November 1917. This assured that Australia, as well as in Britain, Passchendaele became synonymous with futility and the horrors of fighting in mud in Flanders, with 21,800 Australian deaths being occurred, more than a third of all dead during the entire conflict. 1917 was the worst year of the war. The recapture of the strategic town of Villers-Bantagio on the night of the 24th to the 25th of April would become one of the most dominant memories of the war, partly because it was coinciding with the anniversary of the landing at Gallipoli or Anzac Day, and partly because of the grateful French population constructing their town's identity around the memory of this battle for later generations to come. Pushing along the banks of the Somme, capturing the strategic town of Brignon, and then in September and early October 1918 breaking through the Hindenburg Line in the vicinity of Bellachonguise and the Saint-Quentin Canal, the Australian division was now seriously on the strength thanks to the decline of voluntary recruitment at home, and there were several instances of collective ill-discipline verging on mutiny. This reorganization had violated one of the core values which has sustained the morale of the Australian Imperial Force during their 4 years of service without any home leave, comradeship, or the Australians would put it, mateship. Lesser known than their involvement at Gallipoli or even that of the Western Front, in this role the Australians were played in the Palestine campaign against the Ottoman Empire, when the Australian Imperial Force infantry divisions left for Egypt for France in early 1916. The Australians and the New Zealand mounted troops remained to counter the Ottoman threat against the Suez Canal. The multinational force of the British Desert Forces, which had been various titles throughout the war, gradually moved on to the offensive. First, the Mediterranean outpost of Al-Adashir was occupied, and then in December 1916, the Ottoman position of Baghdad. Then it was kind of a warfare which resonated the popular image of the Australian light horsemen, men whom from life of outdoors in the Australian outback and the Australian bushes were naturally equipped for this battle on horseback. But in fact, desert warfare was a chronic shortage of. But in fact, the desert had its drawbacks. For one, the chronic shortage of water, the heat, the command errors, and the competent demands of the Western Front all meant that the progress of Palestine was slow in 1917. It took 3 assaults to capture Baghdad, an operation which was facilitated on the 31st of October 1917 by a spectacular attack, including a charge by the Australian mounted troops at Bashirba, which it was the most spectacular cavalry charge of the war, and possibly one of the last cavalry charges in history after the Polish-Soviet War. Progress again was slow in 1918 thanks to the Allied crisis when the Germans broke through the Western Front, and when the Russians left the Eastern Front, leaving Azerbaijan and all the Transcaucasian countries and the Central Asian countries to the whim of the Ottoman Empire. But after holding out against a large Ottoman offensive in July, the Allied forces shattered the enemy army at Magadigo, advancing with the forces of the Arab Revolt under the leadership of Thomas Edward Lawrence, or some would call him Lawrence of Arabia. They captured Damascus on the 30th of September, and later in October 2 cavalry divisions went to capture Ebelo, a strategic railway junction between 300 kilometers to the north. Though much of this detail of the Palestine campaign has now been eclipsed by popular memory by other campaigns of the war, except for the siege of Jerusalem, the Australians played a critical part and were more naturally suited for desert warfare and horseback riding. The gains for Australia in the First World War were certainly not worth the cost. Almost a fifth of those who served overseas were killed and unknowingly numbers of wounded, and some would die prematurely over the next 2 decades. These losses and those of the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1919 would kill at least another 10,000 Australians, many of whom were young males, and it changed the nation's demographic. During the war, some 6,890 enemy aliens, that is Australians of enemy birth or extraction, had been denied their civil liberties and herded into internment camps, much like the Japanese and other minorities during World War II and World War I. At the war's end, they were not reintegrated into Australian society, but a vast majority of them were deported. Others chose to leave because they could not face staying in a country that would turn so viciously against them. The paranoia about the left-wing radicalism which the Loyalists had fueled during the war had also persisted. Although the syndicalism movements of the former of the industrial workers of the world had been crushed in 1916 and 1917 by means of the Unlawful Association Act, there remain other enemies within, in the form of communists, non-British migrants, Irish nationalists, left-wing radicals, and trade unionists. The War Precautions Act was repealed in 1920, but not much of the surveillance apparatus. The Hugh government, which established during the war, had retained the control of new threats in the established order. The loyalist element of the Australian society also remained mobilised, conducting vigilant-style attacks against meetings of the left, attacking Russian Australians whose loyalty was suspect after the Russian Revolution, and rising private armies to support the civilian authorities in interwar years, especially the daring Emu Wars. Those wars are scary, my friend. Yet, for all its negative legacies, the First World War provided a foundational narrative for the Australian nationalism in the form of the Anzacs, the legend or the myth that proved remarkably enduring. The people that stormed Gallipoli, even though they failed, the Australian and the New Zealand nations were born at Gallipoli. In news of the popular shorthand article of a powerful vision of the Australian soldier as a product of the distinctive society and value system, a society in which the bush shaped the cultural imagination and social morals, in which they learn to be independent in spirit and thus naturally and resourceful fighters, in which the relatives lacked the class that made men willing to challenge rank and authority, in which the quality of mateship was valued above all. They were going to see action in the Second World War, Korea, and even as late as the Vietnam War. But the controversial news of the Conscription Act for service is still debated to this day and divides Australian society again. But the legend, that will come under a serious challenge, including the feminist attack against the inherent misogyny. However, the memory boom within the last 20th century, especially in the participation of the Gulf War, and of course the invasion of Afghanistan, and it revived the word Anzac yet again. And even though it was born 100 years ago, Anzac Day is forever now and forevermore. And of course, the brave men who fought would always look behind their shoulders and say, when you go home, tell them of us and say, for your tomorrow, we gave our today. John Maxwell Edmonds. Thanks guys for watching. Hope you really enjoyed it. Oh my god, 52 minutes, okay. I hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something. This one goes out to a special someone. Modest Pelican, of course. But anyway, seriously, on a real note, this goes out to all the Australians out there. Yep, be proud of yourselves, Anzacs, even though Australian New Zealander Army Corps, guys, come on. Anyway, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something. This one goes out to Georgia, Ryan, the other Ryan, sorry Ryan. This one goes out to Modest Pelican, who actually provided the voice in the first intro. You remember that kid? He was saying, yeah man, my base is being shelled by artillery and shrapnel. That was not Modest Pelican, that was actually me with a great Australian accent. I fooled you all. Phantom Strider, the worst Australian in the world ever. And of course, he is still the best meme. Anyway, I will leave you all with an ancient cry of the white Australian, the white Gurkha. And of course, if you want to hashtag Creole, you can hashtag Cooey. If you want to hashtag Cooey, you can hashtag Cooey. But anyway, let's leave on a note. Let's be loud for a change. They are loud, so let's be loud. Coo. Wait, hold on. Sorry. Cooey. Later, guys. Hope you learned something. And yes, that was a narrate meme, probably. I don't know. Misogyny. Sorry. I'm sorry. Anyway, be politically correct, my friends. And of course, if you want to try an Australian accent, just try me out, bro. I'll punch you in the barbie, shrimp me in the ribs. Of course, we're going to eat some roos tonight. You know, we're going to have some fun. We're going to drink some cheap wine and just chill out with the boys and say can all day long. Alright, boys, hope you learned something. And I hope I offended like 2 million Australians at one time. Because Australia is a big place with a little population. Take that. Haha. Got Australia yet again. Learn something, guys.